The longest season of Epiphany ever. So, I know I do a bit of a recap every week, but I think the operative word for this particular season of Epiphany is wisdom. So we start out with the wise men who see a sign in the cosmos and are seekers of wisdom. And then the next week we have Jesus, who's kind of got his coming out sermon. And he has gone deeply into the wisdom of his own tradition, and he has pulled out words from Isaiah 61. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to empower me to preach good news to the poor, recovery of sight to the blind, and restoration to those who are left out. And then we had a bit of a snow day. And then, so we're back at it. So the passage I'm going to read to you this morning is a passage a little bit further on from Luke. And Epiphany is also a season of signs, right? Wisdom, stars, signs, all kinds of buzzwords associated with this season. And in this particular passage, the disciples of John the Baptist are curious about what is going on. John is in prison, and he's sending his disciples because he is curious about whether or not Jesus is the one who they believed would be the promised Messiah. And that was kind of an identity that everyone wanted to pin on Jesus. And at some level, the institutional church pinned on Jesus, though the original gatherers, that is, people of the way, did not pin that identity on Jesus. So I'm going to read from you an excerpt of this passage where Luke is responding to John's disciples. When the men had come to him, they said, "John the Baptist has sent us to you to ask, 'Are you the one who is to come, or are we to wait for another?'" Jesus had just then cured many people of diseases, plagues, and evil spirits, and had given sight to many who were blind. And he answered them, "Go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have good news brought to them." I'm going to read to you from Eugene Peterson's translation entitled "The Message." And I'm going to be reading to you from 1 Corinthians 13. I suspect some of you have parts of that memorized. I go to Eugene Peterson's translation when I think maybe it's time we heard things just in a new way. Although certainly what we know is 1 Corinthians 13 is a gorgeous piece of poetry. The way of love. If I speak with human eloquence and angelic ecstasy, but don't love, I'm nothing but the creaking of a rusty gate. If I speak God's word with power, revealing all his mysteries and making everything plain as day, and if I have faith that says to a mountain, "Jump," and it jumps, but I don't love, I'm nothing. If I give everything I own to the poor, even go to the stake to be burned as a martyr, but I don't love, I've gotten nowhere. So no matter what I say, what I believe, and what I do, I'm bankrupt without love. Love never gives up. Love cares more for others than for self. Love doesn't want what it doesn't have. Love doesn't strut, doesn't have a swelled head, doesn't force itself on others, isn't always me first. Doesn't fly off the handle, doesn't keep score of the sins of others, doesn't revel when others grovel, takes pleasure in the flowering of truth, puts up with anything, trusts God always, always looks for the best, never looks back, but keeps going to the end. And finally, a couple of verses from 1 John. Beloved, let us love one another because love is from God. Everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, for God is love. So I remember shortly after 9/11, my colleague, and who is known to some of you, Glennis Williams, who was working with refugees in Montreal, and I think you will recall that after that event, the entire world became suspicious of the entire Middle East. And walls went up that had not been up before. And for those who are working with refugees, particularly those with a Muslim or Islamic background, we're seeing evidence of such, what's the word I want? Unkindness and suspicion. And this unkindness and suspicion was translating into the lives of some very, very vulnerable souls on whose behalf Glennis was working. And she thought to herself, Lynn, I've got to write an article, I've got to weigh into this conversation. You know, everybody is asking this question, well, where was God? And I just thought to myself, well, that's not the right question. I think you need to be addressing Glennis. I think the question you need to address, in fact, is who is God? And I think that if we are to kind of take all of those pieces, and we're not proof texters, right? But looking at all those within the tradition who say God is love, love is God. So if we want to talk about God, we need to probably rethink our cosmology and our tradition that put God up there on a throne using language that was borrowed from the empire. So it was like, well, our God is just a bigger, badder, better emperor than you. So we have the language of Lord and King and Judge, etc., which doesn't always take us to a place where we recognize that the full identity of the mystery will never be completely known, but the doorway is love. So then, what does it sound like to replace the word love with the word God? Because I think we can take it both ways. So we would then say God is patient, God is kind, God is not jealous, God does not brag, God is not arrogant, God does not take into account a wrong suffered, God does not rejoice in unrighteousness, God rejoices with truth, God bears all things, hopes all things, endures all things. I think the church would have become a vastly different institution had this been its creed. Not that you believe in God, but what it is that you trust about the character of God or the mystery of the universe. So here are a few thoughts, and they're not necessarily, I'm not going to draw a line between all of them. They're a bit here and there. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who's a priest and also an archaeologist and paleontologist, wrote that love is the very physical structure of the universe. Teilhard believed that at the very heart, at the core of all reality, was God who is love. The source of all that is, the core of everything is love. Another Catholic theologian, Michael Morwood, suggests that after 13.8 billion years of evolution, the divine is at work in the universe, coming into expression in us. And if we are created in the image of God, then love is what we were made for, because love is who we are. Matthew Fox, the Dominican priest excommunicated by the Vatican, suggests that humans may be the only species on earth who are wired not to be who they are. The tree would never say, I don't think I'm going to give you shade today. And the sun would never say, I won't be shining for you today. And the strawberry will never say, I think I will become a bitter fruit. I was given an amaryllis bulb before Christmas. One of these bulb that comes with the dirt kind of thing, and all you have to do is put the dirt in the pot over the bulb. You would think that would be easy for me, wouldn't you? Well, it was before Christmas. So it was 3 weeks before Christmas. And the box just sat there. And about 10 days ago, I noticed that some activity was happening at the top of that amaryllis right there. And it just kind of appeared in this green stem, this streak of pink. And that bulb was going to be an amaryllis with or without me. And so I finally put it in the soil, gave it a cup of water. Isn't it interesting that the intention of that amaryllis was set for life? Indigenous cosmology invites us to take our cue from the creation. The creation is profoundly hospitable and generous. It is not ours, yet it provides the gifts that we need to inhabit. Isn't this a fun expression? A few billion atoms and molecules for the season of our life. It gives us air, sun, water, food. I grew up being reminded of this cosmology at every meal. The eyes have all wait upon thee, and thou givest them their meat in due season. It's just a reminder in front of every meal of how much had come to us. Every major spiritual tradition suggests that love, kindness, thinking of the other, is at the heart of how we will be healthy together. And it was fun for me to see this. I should have had that up earlier. So let me conclude with just a few words that I heard this morning as I caught an interview with Michael Enright with a man whose name is Michael Koren, who in 2012 wrote a book that went viral called Why Catholics Are Right. And he really was the poster child of traditional conservative Orthodox Catholicism and everything that kind of went with it. He would say he wasn't a social conservative. He grew up in working class in Britain, so he wasn't too concerned with who you voted for, but he was exceptionally concerned who you slept with. He then was the champion of the religious right, both in England and in North America, until he had an epiphany. And he changed his mind about it all. And suddenly, at that point, he lost his columns in the newspaper, his speaking engagements, and so on. And at the same time, he experienced profound remorse. His remorse was twofold. First, it was remorse for how he had hurt and shamed those in the gay community. But the bigger remorse was how and he was a gracious, gracious man, but how his gracious traditional stance fueled the less gracious, more hateful stance of his supporters. And you're going to love the name of his book, Epiphany, A Christian's Change of Heart and Mind. When asked what the hardest part of Jesus' teaching was, he said, love God and love neighbor. And then he went on to say that the closest we will ever get to God is in the person beside us, or across from us, or on the other side of the world. And so he concurred with the writer of 1 John that if we are to say that we are of God, then we are invited to be made of love. Epiphany. That new understanding, that new story, that new vision has a measure within our tradition. It is called love, not the Valentine kind, but the earthier kind, the patient and kind and forgiving and non-judging kind. And so when we're wrestling with those smaller questions, bigger questions, global questions, cosmic questions, our tradition, as I suspect do all of the major spiritual traditions, offers one gauge. Will the result of the new story, the new perception, the new narrative be a kinder, gentler, more inclusive world. And not, I think, we're in 2019, for us to think the world is to be inclusive simply for human beings. We're way past that narrative, way past it. And so those epiphanies need to also be measured by kindness and gentleness and inclusion of all living things.